Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to speak to you today at this important event. My sincere thanks to the organizers and to all the attendees for all you're doing for health. My name is Nason Maani, and I have the privilege of serving as an assistant professor in public health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where my research centers on the structural and commercial determinants of health. And I'd like to speak today about the alcohol industry. The outline of my presentation will follow four main areas. First, we're going to talk a little bit about understanding a business that sells harmful products in general, using the example of the tobacco industry. Then we'll look specifically at the alcohol industry and whether it fulfills similar dimensions or requirements. After that, we're going to look at some examples of how those influence the alcohol industry's engagement with public health policy and other initiatives. And finally, what the implications of all this evidence is in terms of our future actions towards the alcohol industry. So first, understanding a business that sells harmful products. In my view, there's no better way to learn about how a business works that sells harmful products than by looking at the example of the tobacco industry. This slide shows the CEOs of the largest US tobacco firms at the time testifying under oath about the addictiveness of nicotine. And this was a pivotal moment in history, as many of you know, because these well-educated, very influential and highly respected CEOs immediately lied under oath, saying that they felt the nicotine was not, in fact, addictive. Days later, the first major leaks occurred of internal industry documents that showed that, in fact, they had known for decades that nicotine was addictive and were using that in the design of cigarettes. And you may be saying, well, can we really learn much from the tobacco industry before we go further? Surely the tobacco industry is unique. And it is unique in one major way, in my view, and that is that the tobacco industry got caught. That's what's unique about it, really. And because they got caught so comprehensively through lawsuits and through leaks, massive internal documentation, we know a lot more about the tobacco industry than we do about any other harmful product producer. We know about their internal workings, and we have many memos, damning memos like this, that says, doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. This is sort of an out-and-out example of how the industry was explicitly seeking to create doubt in the mind of the public and continue its business practices. And the legacy of the tobacco industry is that we have this massive archive of materials, internal documentation about what happens inside an industry that knows it's producing a harmful product, an extremely profitable one, and what it does in response to threats to that product. And aside from the juicy quotes, there are some main lessons we can draw from analyses of internal memos from the tobacco industry. And these have been studied in hundreds of papers at this point, and then reviews made of those studies. One main thing we can say is that the memos show the tobacco industry had knowledge, internal knowledge. They knew that their product caused harms to the users and those around them. They knew that advertising was an incredibly powerful way to increase consumption. And they knew that advertising had to target youth, that youth were a major driver of future growth. Armed with this knowledge, they were also motivated by profit, not by, uniquely evil intent or malevolence, but by profit. Within that, they were motivated by a fear of litigation. They didn't want to be subject to lawsuits, which might impinge on profits. They wanted to protect themselves from regulation, which again, they viewed as threatening to their profits. And they wanted to protect against attacks or concerns about their credibility or image, because that might affect the risk of regulation, that might affect the risk of litigation, and in turn, all these things might affect profit. Because of this knowledge and these motives, they engaged in the wide range of tactics that they're now infamous for. They created controversy and doubt about their product's role in harm. They used third-party organizations and front groups to promote messages that appeared independent to them. They tried to improve their image through poorly evidenced corporate social responsibility, and they tried to prevent evidence-based regulation at every step of the way. And really, I guess the question I want to pose to you is, are these first things really so unique to tobacco? Is tobacco exceptional in the sense that they know their product is harmful, they know about the power of advertising, and they're motivated by those same bullet points under profit? I would say any large multinational company is motivated by those same motives. And if it's producing a harmful product as well, it most certainly knows about the harms its product causes and to whom it causes the most harms. So the heart of the matter really is profit, right? Is these motivations. And once you understand these motivations and the nature of the business model, it allows you to answer a lot of questions that otherwise seem really difficult to answer. They seem confusing. Questions like, why would a company claim to be supporting communities while avoiding tax at the same time? Why would a company pay a third party to dispute their product's impact? Why would they not just put a warning on the label? Why would they choose to focus on poorly evidenced educational initiatives while obstructing evidence-based policy? Why do they fund research while disputing good evidence that's out there? Why are they not more clear about how much is actually good for you? Why do they fight court battles that they know they're going to lose? The answer to all these questions can be boiled down to these simple bullet points for alcohol as for tobacco. So let's look at the alcohol industry and see if we see the same patterns. Do we see similar lessons? Does the alcohol industry have the scale to engage in these activities? Does it have the fundamental conflict of interest that would make it engage in these activities? Does it have the knowledge about its product harms and what the role of advertising is in boosting consumption? So in terms of power, yes. Scholars have noted that the alcohol industry is large and globally consolidated. This graph shows you the global market share of the top 10 companies in each alcohol segment. And what you can see is that in 2017, almost 70% of all the beer sold globally was produced by the top 10 companies that produce beer. About 13% of wine globally produced by the top 10 wine companies, and over half of all spirits consumed were produced by just 10 companies globally. So it's a globally consolidated market, which means there are a few very powerful, very influential actors. In terms of a conflict of interest, well, we have to look at the source of where alcohol industry revenue comes from. This study from the UK really illustrates this. This is data from England, and what you see is that while a small proportion of the population, just 4%, consume at harmful levels, another 21% consume at hazardous levels of alcohol consumption. And while that 25% together is a minority of the UK population, because of the amount they consume, they account for almost 80% of all the alcohol consumed in England. And because of that, that same 25% of those consuming at harmful and hazardous levels represent almost 70% of all the revenue generated by the industry in England. And what this study showed is that if everyone were to drink in moderation, by which I mean drinking at moderate levels at most, that would mean an extremely large drop in profits for the industry of around 40%. There's also a similar conflict of interest when it comes to drinking patterns. This data from the International Alcohol Control Study shows that across many different countries, the proportion of alcohol consumed in harmful drinking occasions is very high, around 50%, with the exception of South Africa, where it's over 90%. 90% of all the alcohol consumed is consumed in harmful drinking occasions in South Africa, according to this data. That means that if alcohol were consumed in non-harmful drinking occasions only, it's quite likely the overall amount of alcohol consumed would decline quite a bit. And in terms of internal industry knowledge about these issues and about the role of advertising in perpetuating them, well, we know now that this is known internally. We conducted a study of internal advertising case studies from the alcohol industry that weren't intended to be made public. And we found evidence of this knowledge. Here's an example from a case study that they wrote on Famous Grouse, which is a whiskey. As is the case in many post-mature markets, whiskey brands are very reliant on a small number of heavy and increasingly aging consumers to provide the majority of volume. Our first advertising task was to protect and build this core drinker base by persuading existing consumers and drinkers of competitive blends to choose the Famous Grouse more often. In the longer term, we had to attract more younger drinkers, the heavy using loyalists of tomorrow. In a separate case study by Scottish Leader Whisky from 2003, blended whiskey suffers from an aging customer profile. Figure 1 shows 62% of heavy users are aged 55 and over, and 39% are over retirement age. Parts of our market are literally dying off, whiskey tumbler in hand. As with many other markets, the Pareto principle applies. 20% of drinkers account for 80% of sales. So rather than struggle to make whiskey appeal to younger consumers like the premium brands, we chose to focus on the core audience of heavy users. We knew that they were older. We knew they were primarily male. We knew that unlike malt users, they tended to be down market. So you have these examples where the industry is quite explicitly targeting heavy consumers, trying to get them to consume more, and is aware that most of their sales come from harmful consumption. So with that being said, then, how does this business model and this conflict of interest relate to the alcohol industry's engagement with public health policy and other initiatives? You might say that, well, whatever the business model, surely corporate social responsibility has its place. Surely the alcohol industry can help through corporate social responsibility. Well, in actual fact, where the benefit to business is associated with a detriment to society, it's almost impossible for corporate social responsibility to be beneficial to society. This graph from a presentation by McKinsey shows how benefits to business through CSR can be associated with almost no benefit to society. And to quote from their report, they say, in what's best referred to as propaganda, CSR activities are focused primarily on building a company's reputation with little real benefit to society. Some cynics suggest that this form of CSR is at best a form of advertising and potentially dangerous if it exposes a gap between the company's words and actions. So is that what we see in the context of the alcohol industry, bearing in mind the fundamental conflict of interest between the industry's business model and population health? Well, we've done some research on a specific form of corporate social responsibility, which is when the alcohol industry funds health charities to communicate about the harms of alcohol. In one of these studies, we collected and analyzed publicly available information from 27 industry or industry-funded alcohol charities or social aspects public relations organizations from around the world. And this included all their public-facing documentation, their websites, other health guidance that they disseminated to the public on alcohol harms. And we compared what they said to independent sources like UK government or WHO's IARC. And what we found is most of these alcohol industry funded organizations were actually misleading the public on cancer risk through either denying or omitting aspects of the link between alcohol and cancer, distorting the cancer risk, misrepresenting it, or distracting, focusing discussion away from the independent effects of alcohol by including lots of irrelevant information like the contribution of sunlight or baking or chemicals as other causes of cancer. In another recent study, we examined the extent to which these same organizations used dark nudges. So a nudge is any aspect of the choice architecture, the environment, that alters people's behaviors in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. It's based on behavioral psychology. And there are a range of nudge types and methods that are used in health promotion to nudge people towards healthier behaviors or disincentivize them from unhealthy behaviors. And what we found is, again, a lot of this alcohol industry corporate social responsibility, even though it's ostensibly about health promotion and reducing harm, actually includes nudges towards more alcohol consumption. So for example, industry-funded charities might tweet about having a sober October and advice, but will show images of people enjoying alcohol and having a good time. Or they may include odd language that primes the reader to think something that's actually not what health promotion charity would want them to think. This tweet starts by saying, today's the day when most people most commonly give up on their dry January efforts. It's a sort of a social norming effect here. It's kind of encouraging people to think, you know, there's nothing wrong with me giving up on dry January. Everyone else is doing it. Or through their campaigns, they're actually kind of subtly giving this image that to drink is actually cool and sophisticated and something to be applauded, rather than something to be viewed as requiring a rethink or requiring reduction. And we identified a range of these misinformation strategies and these nudging effects and sludge, of which I just included a couple of examples. And CSR is just an example of where corporate power actually extends far beyond marketing itself. In a recent framework by Lima and Galea, they showed that corporate power has several dimensions. They can control decision-making and the political agenda. They can define what issues arise in public consciousness and the potential solution to those issues. And they have the power to avert conflict or keep conflict latent. And this framework describes a number of vehicles of power: the political environment, preference shaping, the knowledge environment, the legal environment, the extra-legal environment. And I just want to look at a few examples of these and show you some evidence that we have now about how the alcohol industry uses these vehicles of power to promote its interests. So thinking of the political environment, we have examples of lobbying to obstruct legal drinking age, for example, in South Africa. We have examples of direct participation in government and committees and policy. We have many such examples, but most notably perhaps that the industry actually authored national alcohol policy in several countries in Africa. We obviously have pressure on international organizations occurring on a range of fronts, and many of you will be aware of this. A recent example was where the UK alcohol industry body, the Portman Group, criticized the draft WHO alcohol strategy for being paternalistic and sexist, and released press releases and press briefings on this issue. And of course, tax avoidance, you know, especially in low middle income countries where products are specifically designed to attract a lower standard excise rate, therefore be cheaper in growth markets. Preference shaping is another example. We have examples of corporate philanthropy, like Big Alcohol's attempts to partner with a global fund. Manufacturing doubt, as I just mentioned in our previous study, showing the ways in which the drinks industry is downplaying cancer risk, cardiovascular disease risk, and risk to pregnant women. And preference shaping through corporate social responsibility, you know, kind of implanting these subtle messages, pro-drinking messages in materials and focusing on largely ineffective responsible drinking initiatives. And of course, they also shape preferences through marketing and advertising and targeting vulnerable populations, like the other study we just talked about. And they also impact on the knowledge environment. They fund science that is advantageous to their interests. And you know, Jim McCabridge and Sue Golder just published a paper showing how where the alcohol industry funded systematic reviews, these tended to come out with more favorable outcomes for the link between alcohol and cardiovascular disease. And we had the recent controversy around alcohol funding the moderate alcohol and cardiovascular health trial in the US, which was suspended. And we also have evidence of them opposing research agendas that might improve population health, like, for example, exerting pressure until a study examining cancer labels on alcohol was halted in Canada. So we have examples of how the industry has attempted to engage with, interfere with public health policy, And we've talked about how this is based on their fundamental conflict of interest, the nature of the industry and their business model, and how that's consistent with other harmful product businesses. So what are the implications of all this? Well, one good implication is that there is a growing understanding at many levels, and it's definitely incomplete, it's definitely growing, it's not complete yet, that the alcohol industry is not like the others. It's more similar in many ways to the tobacco industry in its behavior, in its structure, and in its motivations in some ways. Just because the products themselves are different doesn't mean that the industry, its behaviors, its motives are not very similar to tobacco. It's a major barrier to SDGs. We know there's a clear irreconcilable conflict of interest in health and development, and we've talked about that in this presentation. They pursue much of the same playbook, and corporate social responsibility is definitely being applied as a way to preserve revenue and is consistent with their other corporate political activities. The gap between industry words and deeds is certainly becoming more obvious. And I show this example image, which is of a supposed corporate social responsibility activity by Johnny Walker, the whiskey, where they put all these life-size golden statues of Johnny Walker on a bridge in South Africa as this kind of statement somehow against domestic violence, even though South Africa is among the world leaders in worst domestic violence incidents and outcomes and femicide, and alcohol is associated with the majority of those incidents. And really, these seem totally inconsistent and, very, very problematic. And you wonder why these things occur unless you go back to the core motivation, that a lot of these activities and others are motivated by profit, and within that, a fear of litigation, seeking to distract, a protecting from regulation, seeking to avoid regulation that might impinge on profits, and by concerns about credibility and image. There is, however, a big challenge, and that's the challenge posed, in my view, by global alcohol industry philanthropy, particularly in the post-COVID era, where there's a lot of emphasis on philanthropy, a lot of emphasis on what business can do to help out in building back better. And the involvement of the alcohol industry in such initiatives risks health washing the industry, associating it with positive outcomes and distracting from its harms. It risks undermining evidence-based approaches to reduce industry influence and to improve population health and policymaking. And it risks resetting what has been a gradual denormalization of the industry at the global level in response to evidence. And an example of this that I and others have been concerned about is the case of the WHO Foundation. This foundation was launched recently last year to broaden the WHO donor pool. So it's a supposedly independent foundation to the WHO that claims to be guided by PHENSA, the framework for engagement with non-state actors that the WHO has to follow. But that framework is what stops the WHO from engaging more with the private sector, from taking that money directly. So the WHO Foundation exists to accept those funds the WHO cannot accept directly due to PHENSA. So you can already see there's a kind of inherent contradiction. If it's consistent with PHENSA, then how is it accepting the money that the WHO can't accept because of PHENSA? Initially, for quite a few months, the WHO Foundation had no published conflict of interest policy for donations. And then when they were published, an early version mentioned that alcohol industry donations were on a red list, could not be received along with tobacco and firearms. However, in more recent versions, they've removed alcohol from the red list. And this is in part problematic because to date, the WHO Foundation has not released a list of donors of any kind, no amounts or agreements with donors since it launched in 2020. And this is very problematic, obviously, bearing in mind the last slide. Could donations from industry in this way dwarf the WHO's own relatively small budget to tackle alcohol-related harm? Quite possibly. How can civil society hold these donors and the WHO Foundation to account when it's not clear what the donations are, what the engagement has been, if any at all? And this is why we wrote this commentary, which I encourage you to maybe take a look at and think about and how it applies to your own advocacy and research efforts. So in conclusion, the alcohol industry has great expertise and commercial interest in manufacturing, marketing, and selling alcohol. That is what it's good at, not public health. And the fact that often in research, there is an undue focus on the product itself or on the consumers rather than the role of the extremely powerful producers and marketers, that's a focus that's heavily encouraged by the industry. A key reason for industry involvement in public health agendas is because otherwise effective public health policies would pose a business risk. And we talked about the conflict of interest there. Facilitated by corporate social responsibility and partnership, this involvement includes fostering doubt about product harms, substituting effective approaches with ineffective or harmful ones, and attempting to shift blame for harms away from producers. This means there's a strong case for regulation that aims at denormalizing alcohol industry presence in policy, evidence, and health, as has been done for tobacco. With that, I want to thank you very much for listening, particularly thanking my collaborators, Mark Pettigrew, Maevan Shalwick, Cecile Nye, and Sandro Golea, my funders, and my contact details are here if you have any questions or comments. Thank you very much.